Hello everybody online, this is Roisin here and I've got Fiona Keoghan with me who's going to speak to us on building a model line for frailty. We're here in Navan Hospital, so broadcasting from Navan today. We have a lot of content to get through, so I'm not going to give much heed to this, but I'm sure you've all heard of Fiona from before. She's Service Improvement Lead in Ireland East Hospital Group, a chartered physio, and is working a lot now on leading out on the frailty value work stream across Ireland East Hospital Group. So we're going to hear a lot of Fiona's experiences, and thanks a million to her for joining us today. So we want to keep the webinar as interactive as possible. So throughout the webinar, you can write any comments or questions into the chat box, which is at the top right-hand corner of the screen. We'll deal with them either as we go through the webinar or at the end. We will have some time for comments and questions then. Also, we do have a Twitter site, so if you're in the room with a couple of people, please do tweet at QI Talk Time. Send us a photo of you in the room and get the conversation going around frailty. So without further ado, I'm actually going to hand over to Fiona, who's going to take us through her content. Thanks a million, Fiona.
Thank you. I suppose I'd like to thank the Quality Improvement Division for asking me to give this talk. What I have, I suppose, put into my content, not necessarily in this order because I've jumped around the place in the presentation, is describing the reason for needing to develop a model line or a pathway for older people and a response to frailty, what the current state is and what we're finding in our work. I'm going to describe a little bit the methodology that we're using here in Ireland East. I'm going to describe some of the measurement that we're doing and some of the data that we're finding. But I also want to talk a little bit about the leadership that's required in order to do what we're setting out to do and give you some insight into the barriers and challenges and also the enablers and the positive things that we're finding as we do this work, and hopefully also describe our plans for the next step. Obviously, I'm very open to questions, so keep them coming, and we'll hopefully have some time for conversation as well at the end. Just for those who aren't familiar with Ireland East, it is the largest of the hospital groups in Ireland. It has 11 hospitals, 6 of which are voluntary, and there's 5 HSE hospitals there, overlapping with 5 community health organisations. Population of 1.3 million, 11,000 staff, and it's covering North Dublin, Meath, West Meath, Carlow, Kilkenny, Wicklow, Wexford, and South Dublin as well. And so I guess that large geographical area and the fact that there is overlap between 5 CHOs makes this a very complex issue to resolve. Ireland East, as part of its plan for improvement, has developed what are called key True North metrics, and these are person-centeredness, operational excellence, continuous improvement, and optimization of patient flow and optimization of resource utilization, and keeping the patient at the center of all that we do. And Ireland East is using lean methodology to deliver this. And the area I'm working in is service improvement, where all of the work is at the moment mainly in the unscheduled care pathway, and there is a particular focus at the moment on frailty. And I've been doing this job now for a year exactly today, and before that I had some experience of doing this in Beaumont, where I suppose I have seen the benefits of getting this right at the start. In Ireland, as you know, we have the National Strategy and Integrated Care Programme, and there are some very nice structures and a nice strategy in place around how to do this. What we are setting out to do, I suppose, is create the conditions to bring all this to fruition and start the work in our acute hospitals to make a difference for integration for our older people. We have when you look at the care needs, I suppose, or the integrated model of care, we need to think about the entirety of the population. We need to think about how we get this right at the start for those in our population who aren't frail yet, but as we get older, this is going to change right up to those who have the highest care needs, and having what we like to describe as services wrapped around the patient when they reach that point, so that access to the services they need is easy. Of course, that's what's very difficult about this. There are many reasons which we are very familiar with around why we need to change the model of care for older people. And they are obviously the changing demographic, and the graph on the right of the slide shows the change in the population for Ireland East that is projected, and how many more over 85s we are going to have as we go forward, and how we need to change the way we deliver services to cope with this. We also have increasing demand, obviously, as that demographic changes. We have changing patient, family and carer expectations. And we also have, I suppose, a new old population who are, IT savvy, have different expectations of their older age, perhaps, than they were in the past. Evidence that hospitalisation causes harm, and I'm going to touch on that a bit during the presentation, and how we need to flip our thinking around using hospital admission as a default for older people, accepting that our current model is too hospital-centric and it's not responsive enough when somebody's in a crisis, and also that our community services are not designed to be responsive to maybe fast-tracking people back out into the community. We're spending a lot on our healthcare, and it is too expensive, and it is probably partly to do with the fact that we have over-professionalised care. We have a lot of different professionals involved, and we have a lot of duplication. We also have a lot of gaps, and we need to change the way we work to provide the needs the patient has, as opposed to what our particular, often siloed thinking can be. And we need to go right back to how we train our graduates, and how we are preparing people to work in a new workforce, which really doesn't exist yet, where people work outside the traditional roles that they probably are trained for. So we need to think about that. And we also need to learn from what's happening in other jurisdictions. There's some really nice new models of care emerging in across Europe, in places like Holland, in the UK, but also in places like New Zealand, where we can see how true community integration is happening. We're lucky in Ireland in that we have very good information around the population in Ireland from TILDA, and we know that a survey of the over 65s in Ireland showed that 31% are well and robust, 45% are pre-frail, and 24% are frail. So that's nearly a quarter of the patients are frail who are over 65. So, and that's living in the community. And of course, those who access care through the hospital, that goes up. So these people are already in our system, and we need to consider, I suppose, how we support that. This graph just shows the changing demographic in a different way, with the graph on the right, with the purple line, the top one, showing the exponential growth in the over 85, and the curve on the other side showing the ED admissions by age, so exponentially growing when you hit over 85, and we're actually more than halfway along that curve. So in many ways, the experiences that we're having in our EDs with this changing demographic are very real, and the change is happening as we speak, and we need to be responding now, and it is only going to keep on going. The tail end of that, the care needs of people when they reach 85, exponentially growing. They also use way more community resources, but 12.5% of all of our discharges are using over 57% of the beds. So getting this right will have a huge impact on our bed capacity also. Why is frailty so relevant right now? Why are we hearing so much about frailty? Not a new thing, but it's very common, and it's complex, and people can live with frailty very well in the community, but they're very fragile, and it's a fragile state. And if we can identify frailty easily, and if we can instigate comprehensive geriatric assessment and figure out what people's care needs are. And in conversations with the patient and their family, we can cross over into their social needs as well as their health needs and focus on the personal outcomes. We end up with a very different conversation about what our older people need. This is, I suppose, just to get us thinking a little bit about the care, the needs of people and the hierarchy of our needs, from physiological right up to self-actualization, and how health and safety is a manifestation of this. I suppose when you get older, this changes over time, and it can get flipped, in that your need for self-actualization, I suppose, reduces, and your safety and physiological needs become more important, or we perceive they become more important. And patients will tell us they are willing to sacrifice some of that safety, and sometimes their own survival, for the sake of something that means more to them, regardless of their age. And I think that's something that we often forget in healthcare of older people. And what we end with, if we try to create a very safe environment that keeps our older people far away from harm, is that we place them in a controlled and supervised institutional existence, a medically designed answer to unfixable problems, a life designed to be safe, but empty about anything that older people care about, and how we really need to think long and hard about that. And I'm reflecting back on, we do a lot of patient journeys and a lot of looking at patient experiences as part of this work. And when you look at the language that we use in healthcare, you can see how it is very current, it is very problem-orientated and risk-averse. And as a result, we use language like somebody not being back to their baseline, describing them as not having any potential, no capacity perhaps, not safe to go home, failing their rehab, failing their OT or PT, failing their home visit, and I suppose setting goals in hospitals that may not even be appropriate for the person, how they live their lives, and also how we write those goals, saying how far people need to walk, etc., as opposed to how they need to function, and how we contribute to developing a consensus around what the best thing for people to do would be. And really understanding what they live like outside of the hospital and how they lived prior to admission, which might be living with a lot of risk, or what we would perceive as risk, but as they would wish. The British UK, the Royal College of OTs, have brought out a lovely document which is called Embracing Risk, Enabling Choice, which you could find online. It's really worth a look at. I think it's a lovely flip on this kind of thinking, and that there is some risks that we do need to embrace, and we need to stop seeing it only through that lens. And the question needs to be asked, whose risk is it anyway? Is this really the health professional's risk? Are we really taking the risk? Or is it the patient's risk, and do they have a choice in that? I love this particular photograph, which I saw on Twitter. I believe it was on the front of the Cork Examiner, and it went viral internationally during the snow last March. An 87-year-old woman and her grandson. And when I saw it, it made me think about what would happen if that lady crashed at the end of that slope and fractured her hip and ended up in hospital, and what judgment a health and social care professional might make about that woman's decisions and her grandson's choice that he made to put her on that homemade sled and take her down a hill, and how the sheer joy in her face, the joy in his face, and how that's how older people want to live, and they don't necessarily see themselves as old. And we need to allow that to continue. What is important as well is to consider the factors that make an older person resilient, and they are slightly different to what makes a young person resilient. And there are things that make an older person who may be very frail may still be resilient enough to continue to live at home. So you have the psychological resilience of people, their mobility, their financial resilience, and I suppose you know yourself, people who can afford to pay for more care, etc. It does make them more resilient, and they can prepare their homes, etc. for later life compared to those who don't have that support. their environmental resilience, their physical resilience, their social resilience, and their cultural resilience. So if you come from a different culture, perhaps, and you're living here, how difficult that can be. Or in other ways, they may have different expectations, so their resilience may be stronger also. So, but we do need to consider all of this when we're thinking about what older people can do in terms of taking risks. And we need to ask, of course, what matters to the patient, and asking the questions in a very different way rather than is it safe or not safe. So what is the patient's understanding of the situation and their outcomes? What are their fears? What are their hopes? What are they willing to sacrifice, and what are they not willing to sacrifice? So things that older people tell us that they don't want. For example, one of the things older people say that they don't want is they absolutely don't want to wear incontinence pads, or you know, they absolutely hate being catheterized, and how that can often be done in hospital as something that is more convenient, and it is described to the patient as it's better for you and you won't have accidents, etc. But actually how devastating that can be for an older person, and how these are the things that actually make them not want to stay living, and that's what they would tell us. And what is the best course of actions that would meet all of this for you, and what would make you feel safe to go home? And that piece, that question can tell you a lot, because it's often a lot less than we think. And then there's the piece around what they need to know when they're in hospital. So what's wrong with them, what's going to happen to them, and when they're going to happen. How are the team going to judge when the person can go home, and when is it likely to be? And I think that's quite sad, really, when you think about all the people who are potentially in hospital and have absolutely no idea what the plan of care is for them, and it's their lives. In Ireland East, we linked up with the Acute Frailty Network because of the journey that the Acute Frailty Network has been on, and the fact that they're a lot further down the line than we are in Ireland, and also the fact that they have some very robust principles, and they have also, I suppose, a culture where there's openness to sharing and learning from other sites. So these are the 10 key principles which we use to establish the services as we go through our sites. And we're here in Navan this week doing a rapid improvement event and working our way through these principles to ensure that as we start to build a service here, we're doing it with these things in mind. So establishing a mechanism for early identification of people with frailty, putting in place a multidisciplinary response that initiates a comprehensive geriatric assessment within the first hour if they're identified as frail, or 14 hours if they've come in out of hours. Set up a rapid response system, which is multidisciplinary. Set up a silver phone system, which is where you have what's called a silver phone, but it's like an emergency call system for somebody who's very frail and perhaps deteriorating rapidly and might be in our emergency department. Adapt clinical professional standards, and there's huge evidence on this out there. One of the great go-to Bibles is the Silver Book, but there are many others, and there's a huge amount of sharing through the Acute Frailty Network. Strengthen the links both inside and outside the hospital, and that piece is absolutely critical. And so when we do our Rapid Improvement Weeks here, we include people from all across the spectrum or the system, I suppose. We have a lot of representation here in Navan this week in the community. And we put in place education and key training for staff, being another one. And in Ireland, again, very lucky, we have the TILDA training. So for us, it's to make sure that people are accessing that hospitals are supporting people to be trainers and to get that information out there, and to ensure that there's a framework around that information getting to as many people as possible. Developing a measurement mindset and getting frontline staff to learn how to measure, to know that they're improving. Identifying who these clinical change champions are, and identifying an executive sponsor. And our project management structure is done through our lean methodology. And the executive sponsor piece is obviously very important so that the work is supported and ongoing. So we have, I suppose, identified the following as our unscheduled care gateway: the emergency department, the assessment and decision piece around whether somebody's admitted or not, what happens if somebody is admitted, and then what happens post-acute care. And But this is all the pathway, and then what the things are that need to be in place come from that. So in the ED, it is that identification of frailty on presentation, as I said, the multidisciplinary assessment, and identifying alternative pathways. Do we only have the ED as our place that we can access care? Then we have similar then around if somebody's in the ED, how do we prioritise that queue, and how do we make sure that the most frail receive the right care, and that we develop an ethos of a frailty unit within our ED. And you don't need a purpose-built unit to develop that ethos, although it would be nice. It is often about really thinking about things like strong lighting, noise, nutrition, hydration, the appropriate mattress, mobilising people, making sure that those who are fit to sit are not in the catching trolleys, and that we identify all the various components of somebody's needs, and that we keep an eye on them because they can change very, very quickly in the emergency department setting. And then if somebody's admitted, it is all the pieces that need to happen to ensure that a frail older person doesn't get stuck, or if they have complex needs from a discharge perspective, that they are identified on admission, and that there is immediate liaison with community services, families, carers, etc., to ensure people don't get stuck. And then from there on, it's active, proactive management and trying to get people back out and onto the care that they need. And as I said earlier, that whole piece can't happen without considering the whole continuum of care. So in our service improvement approach, as I said, it is a lean methodology. So we have valuing and visioning workshops, which we start off our work on site with. We bring everybody together. We talk about the values that we wish to see in how we work, but also creating a vision for what the service should look like. And there's huge similarity in this, but there are also differences because different sites have different strengths, different assets, different components that have evolved over time. So the gaps that people have are also very different. And then we also have, we try to pull as many clinical leaders and champions in as we can. So using the lean healthcare, then we have, I suppose, a box of tools, but it's box of tools. It's more than that. So we're trying to create a system that works when we go away, and we're also trying to create a culture that is very enabled, and I suppose creating the conditions for this to flourish. This is an A3. This is the tool that we use throughout our week. So we work our way through this, and it's called an A3 because it fits on an A3 page. And so the first one would be our reason for action, and we go under the bonnet as such, and we look at what the current state is. We set targets, which are based against those key principles, and then we do a gap analysis from where we are now, and then we start looking at our solutions. We also, during the week that we do the improvements, we do a series of rapid experiments. So we will test things live. For example, going to the emergency department and testing different like assessments, or using different tools, trying to contact services to find out what's available, etc. So we find the pitfalls as we go, and we develop a plan that's realistic and reflective of the service that we're working in. And then we work through that over a 30, 60, and 90 days. So it's a 3-month piece of work that the team own this, and constant reflection back, we call insights as well, looking back on what we're learning as we go, so that we don't lose any of that as we go through the piece of work. And why do we do this? I suppose it is because we want to change the culture. We want the way we do things to be different, and we have to acknowledge that this piece takes time and can be difficult to measure. So we want to, I suppose, see it reflected in the behaviours of people, our staff, behaviour of our leaders, and I suppose we want it to be the way that we do things. And the big compelling reason for that is in these stark facts, which I'm sure most of you have seen before. So nearly half of you over 85 die within a year of an emergency admission. and that hospitalization is potentially causing harm. And going back to that, the evidence around 10 days in hospital leading to the equivalent of 10 years of aging in the muscles of people aged over 80. There's more, I suppose, the other pieces being around crowded emergency departments and the harm that's caused there. And given that emergency departments are often the only places people can access care. Patients waiting over 12 hours for a bed have a 2.35 times increase in their hospital length of stay. And drugs are much more likely, for example, to be given late. So that's a difference of between 31% and 72% in a crowded ED. So obviously the harm that would be caused by that. And there's also evidence of increased mortality with longer ED lengths of stay. So the reasons, the compelling reasons for doing this are there. This picture, I suppose, is again reflective of that. There's a poster, what happened to my legs when I broke my arm. So the fact that people don't get to move in hospital. And no matter how much we think we're doing rehab, we will never, we don't ever get people moving the way they would be if they were at home. Because of the nature of how we provide care in hospitals and how, going back to the deconditioning, the impact that's having on people. This slide is also important. This is from the UK, but given that less than half of our over 75s get out of our ED department in 6 hours, it's very much the case here too. And just the notion that the longer people stay in the emergency department, the more likely you are to have delayed discharges. We do not do well around our over 75 getting out of the emergency department in a short period of time, even if they are going home. And the impact of poor access for emergency admission was leading to that increased length of stay, increased care needs, and increased cost, and a poorer quality patient experience, potentially causing harm to the patient, which is absolutely not what we want. There's also the issue of, and this often comes to how hospitals work, thinking that we don't want to send people home too early, or keeping people in hospital to have their lunch, or perhaps feeling that we're doing people a favour and having an impact then on the system. So this graph is showing very nicely how by people not leaving the hospital on time, you create a lot of patient movement out of hours, which is unsafe. So a lot of patients going to their beds after 4 p.m. in the evening, which we know is the practice in many of our EDs, and needs to be changed. Thinking about frailty, going back to from a clinical perspective, what we need to be thinking about is in frailty it's different to a normal presentation, and the abnormal can be very normal and the atypical can be typical. And we need to consider things like how somebody is moving, what the gait is like, their mental state. These are vital signs in frailty. If somebody isn't able to talk and walk at the same time, or slows down if they have to talk, that is a trigger to get you thinking about what somebody, either their cognitive status or their temporary cognitive status, perhaps their delirium, etc., could be going on there. Flipping the thinking, is it safe to admit a person as opposed to, or is it safe for them to stay in hospital, rather than thinking, is it safe to discharge, which is how we often think. And then there are key things which obviously we absolutely do need to admit. So if somebody is acutely dysniac, they have an acute confusion that isn't resolving, or if they're coming in with any sort of weakness, there would be things where you would say, okay, this is further investigation so that you don't go too far off. But you do need to challenge the perceptions. And there are other things that are often big indicators when you're looking at an older person, which many of you will know, looking at somebody's feet, looking at maybe somebody who has worn maybe a big overcoat and then underneath they're very scantily dressed, or so underneath you can see the rest of their personal hygiene. So their self-neglect and their inability to care for themselves can be very evident. In Ireland, we have been using the clinical frailty scale as our way of deciding how frail, categorizing frailty, and it's a very simple tool developed by Rockwood, which categorizes people from 1 to 9. So after somebody has screened for frailty, we can then categorize how frail they are, and then this creates a common language that we're able to use across the system. And I think a Frailty scale is very useful because it then can help us to think about what do we need to think about. So, for example, if they're a 1, that they're active and independent and you don't need to be concerned. A 4 to a 6 is vulnerable, but their mortality risk is less than 6%. And 8 is very severely frail and completely dependent, and their risk of death goes right up. And then those scoring 9 or more are terminally ill. But even this language of thinking about it like this will help us to think about what we need to be considering in somebody's care needs, including if they're going back home, what's down the road for patients and their carers. And this is coming from a lovely guide that came out in June of this year, the Ambulatory Emergency Care Guide for Same-Day Acute Frailty Services. So it's telling you what to do if you're 1 to 3, 4 to 6, or 7 to 9. And again, as our sites are using the Think of Frailty scale more and more, it helps guide them to think about what they need to be doing next. So if somebody is going from a 6 on to a 7, are you thinking about end of life? Is anybody having those conversations? They shouldn't really happen in the emergency department, obviously, but there are hopefully alternatives, and if there aren't, they need to be developed where this stuff can happen in day hospitals or in other places or on wards if it's happening as part of a family multidisciplinary meeting, etc. This is the VIP screening tool. This is used for screening all over 75 on the acute floor. It's a very simple tool with 3 questions, and it basically will flag if the patient is at risk of frailty or not. And then from there, this will then send a trigger, which is the beginnings of that acute frailty network plan, or the special principle. So screening for frailty using this being automated has been extremely well brought into by our emergency department as part of this work, and we have it happening now on 3 sites, soon to be 4, hopefully with Navan, and so it then is able to tell us of the patients who are presenting how many of them are frail. And then from there, using the Think of Frailty scale, if frail, how frail, and from there we hope to work forward in terms of projecting care needs of these patients. And this is just an example from Mullingar showing what they were able to do when they started out on this work. So this is everybody over 75 on a daily basis, and the red line underneath showing you how many of those who came in were actually frail. And obviously you're getting down then into really nice nitty-gritty, if you like, in terms of planning. You need to be able to respond to 6 frail patients in their emergency department a day, which is slightly over half of all their presentations, and nearly 55% of those being admitted. So when they go up the house, that's also followed through. Also, this slide is again from Mullingar, but it's again very nice evidence around the relationship between age and frailty. And being older doesn't necessarily mean that you're frail, and some younger old people are frailer, but you can see the growth there as you, and certainly by the time you reach 85 years of age, you're probably about 70% of those are likely to be frail, and everybody beyond that. So even if the screening isn't happening, the care needs of those older people are definitely going to be there. So needing to know what good looks like and needing to know what good care looks like is a big part of the plan. But then once we do know what that looks like, are we finding these frail people? What are we doing about it? And what should we be doing about it? So as we go on, it is really about doing the right things properly, because oftentimes we find components of the right things happening, but not necessarily at the right time, not necessarily properly, and not necessarily being communicated on. So that the first piece happens really nicely, and then the implications for the patient aren't considered, and it doesn't go on from there. So it is about carrying this all the way through. This is coming again from the Emergency Care Improvement Programme in the UK, but it's what smart hospitals do. And this is globally, but a lot of it is about frailty, so focusing on the admission pathway with early assessment to maximise emergency day care, focus on those who need to be admitted, assess early and short stay, maximise emergency day care, Assertively manage frailty and tackle deconditioning, focus on downstream flow, so stopping delays at the end, have processes to reduce them, focus on simple discharges. So the majority are simple, even though it can feel like they're not, and not over-assess in hospital, and work as a system, team of teams, and this comes out a lot, the fact that it can take a whole system of people to keep one person at home, particularly the very frail ones, and how none of it can be done if it's person dependent. It has to be through a series of people, and it requires that kind of thinking. It's important to think as well when we talk about capacity that the beds are not the capacity, and at any one time in any of our systems, in any of our hospitals, there's probably a quarter to a third of patients who could be at home if there was an alternative available for them. So thinking about beds being the place where patients wait for the next thing to happen, and beds are really what people wait for the next decision to be made, and they're not necessarily the place they need to be. We use a lot of the Emergency Care Improvement Programme tools, the red and green bed days being one. So a red day being a day of no value to a patient, and a green day being a day of value where planned things happen for patients. And trying to focus on that helps to get people thinking about adding value to the patient journey daily. Also the safer patient flow bundle, all of these things, if you're not familiar with them, are available on the Emergency Care Improvement Programme website, and are really worth looking at in terms of good standard practice. Reviewing all patients who are 7 days or more in a hospital being another piece that we want to work on, and that would be around what happens when people are already a week in hospital, that we need to be having multidisciplinary and family meetings, and we need to be considering the next step so that people don't get stuck. Asking what the patient's wishes are and what's needed to resolve the issues. I will talk a little bit further on about the problems that we find, but it is often the breakdown in communication at this point that leads to protracted length of stay and very challenging discharges. These 4 questions are again from the Emergency Care Improvement Programme, but they're really nice and we use them for feedback. Do I know what's wrong with me? What is being excluded? What's going to happen to me today and tomorrow? What do I need to achieve to get home? And when should I expect to go home? And it is really quite shocking when you ask people these questions, how little they know about the care they're receiving. And we need to think about it. If a patient and their family are informed, they will also be empowered to do a lot more for their people. We use some tools like this from the Acute Frailty Network, which is a very simple patient experience feedback tool where they can circle words that they use, and also put them into this is IT enabled, but it will give you back sort of a mood board that looks like this that tells you what people are finding. So we need to understand the back door as well as the front door, that demand to get out. I already said that's the number of beds that can be stuck with these people who are waiting to get out. I'm aware there's probably only about 5 minutes left about that. So I'm going to,
if anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat box. We have some time at the end to deal with those. So get typing.
Yeah, and I'll run through some of this very quickly. This one here is just around thinking about the stranded patients, and any of you that are working at ward level will know the description is people who are 14 days or more in hospital, and often these are, they will have had care delivered at the beginning by a consultant that then gets passed on to junior doctors who are relatively inexperienced and are holding a whole pile of these kinds of patients, and they don't actually know the system outside either or what's available. They often have multiple chronic problems, and so they end up in this whole situation where they're having more and more tests, more and more investigations, or maybe not, with nothing happening, and how they can end up getting stuck in that, and how we see it in the patient's charts. You'll have query long-term care, query home care package, query, and no decision-making and no plans around going forward. So the language that's used around it is what can you do to rescue these situations? Can you bring everybody together, and can we figure out what it is that people need? But also what can be done to prevent for getting to that point. And again, nice resource, published in June, a guide to reducing long hospital stays. the main author on this is Liz Sargent, who is a physiotherapist for DSIP, who does a lot of work around this whole ethos, creating the system which I've just talked about. We put a lot of work into winning over the hearts and minds and spending a lot of time. We use Twitter a lot to spread message, to connect people to each other, and we've been very successful in that regard, in that we've had Mullingar helping Wexford, we've had Kilkenny helping Mullingar, Kilkenny helping Wexford, we now have Mullingar helping Navan. We share it that way, and it helps with the sustainability, but it also means that people are also connecting internationally with other places and learning stuff and going way ahead of often what we set out to do, which is really fantastic to see. And we run a whole series of master classes over time then to try and get exposure to what's going on. The kind of things that we need to get the service we desire, I suppose the big things are to challenge the status quo and to stop assuming that things should be based on what they were before, challenging that professional and institutional domination to a patient-first one. I'll pass on this. Maybe it will be available if anybody would want them around what's available outside. For frontline staff, I suppose asking, are we using our competencies, skills and experience to their full potential? And I go back to your EDs, where we know that from all of our evidence, at least half of our over 75s are frail, and nearly all of those, if they're frail, need to be physio and or OT, or the other way around. If they're working in an interdisciplinary way, about a third will have nutritional needs, and at least half of them will need a pharmacist. You know, there are things that they shouldn't need referrals to see, and we need to come out of our silos and think about that. I suppose the other things would be to, if somebody is frail, discharging them from treatment or saying they're medically fit when they're actually stuck. And if we discharge them, they're hugely at risk of going off. And not challenging that culture, not challenging our culture bigger than that, our society culture around how we're treating our older people. This is feedback from patients, stuff they tell us. They're afraid to come into emergency departments. They know they're going to spend a long time on a trolley. They often leave it until they're in that crisis. And also the only way they can access services or get them started is to come in, because there's such a gap out there. There's very little preventative stuff happening because there isn't a resource to do that. And it's easier to admit. I suppose our NPHDs and our staff will tell us it is easier to admit than to discharge because the responsiveness is not there. The big things from a component for successful implementation, I would say the big ones are clinical leadership, really helps to get it going, but also creating frontline staff safety, and by that I mean psychological safety to work a little bit differently, work to the top of their license, to really take on the full patient story and to be able to share that. Looking at measurement, I might just go into some of that because I know we're running out of time. This was just to give an example of Mullingar's journey. This was a poster they created, and this is some of their work on the communication piece, like the kind of stuff they created in their hospital to get their message out there. The measurement piece around, it's different to performance measurement. It is looking at being very clear about what you want to measure and really understanding your own service and what happens to people then depending on their care needs. We have performance dashboards in IHG, and we have developed one particularly for the over 75s. And as we go, we will hopefully see these shifts in our, in our individual sites. But it's really what's happening underneath that we want to go after. So those that we do get to, are we making a difference on? And which is why we need to keep that local information. And at the moment, that is quite a laborious task, often involving Excel spreadsheets, but it's really worthwhile because it's owned by the staff on the ground. This is lovely information from Mullingar at their 90-day or 3-month report out, showing the increase in the volume of patients they got home and the decrease in the percentage discharged to nursing home, which is ultimately what this is all about. And that's showing it in a different way, showing the number, the blue line, the numbers getting out in 7 days, so over 80%. and the numbers staying greater than 14 days being the standard ones, reducing right down. So that's the kind of stuff we want to go after, reduction in length of stay. And a real measure of improvement is reducing readmission rates, particularly in the first 7 days, which is essentially having a failed discharge. So this is from Kilkenny, and it's showing, you look at day 1 and day 2 particularly, the huge reduction in the people who flip back in on the same day or within the first 3 days when the care was provided properly at the start. And also the other piece would be when they do come back in, they consume a lot less bed days because everybody knows their needs from the previous admission and they can get back out much faster. This is just some pictures of the various teams that are growing, each one developing its own culture and ethos, and how we, I suppose, try to celebrate that. And again, this is the Minister for Health meeting, Danielle, who's the OT NPG champion down in Kilkenny. But getting that message out there and the massive ownership that's taken on site and all of these. This is our next masterclass, which is on Tuesday of next week, which we have some UK people coming over. And if there's anybody listening who particularly would like to attend, if you want to get in touch, we can see if we can get you an invitation. And this is my last slide. And I suppose it is, the picture of the flock of birds is about something I heard from somebody called Paul Plesk, who's the guy who says things like a farmer, and farmers don't shout at their crops, they give them the conditions to grow. But also he uses this analogy of the flock of birds, and it's that you're not trying to get everybody to do exactly the same thing. You want them all flying in the one direction. You want people following behind and I suppose not resisting and coming with you and making this happen. And thank you all very much for listening. I'll take some questions if there are any.
Great, thanks a million, Fiona. Roisin here again. You're very quiet on the chat box, so I had a few questions actually as we went through. Just thank you so much again, Fiona, for an excellent presentation and sharing all your work, great work that seems to be getting a bit of momentum within IEHG group. Just I suppose a couple of things of all my post-its down here, but you mentioned at the start about, the 4 key areas, the ED, the inpatient, the post-acute, and I suppose I'm sure the big challenge there is once they move from department, how do you ensure that continued thinking around how we treat our frail patients? Have you any tips or any learnings from the sites we've worked on?
Sure, and I suppose what we have developed is visual cues. We use visual cues quite a lot, so the use of a symbol, so it's that MPIS sticker in Mullingar, the GEM sticker in Kilkenny, but it's something that identifies the person. It can be an orange S, for example, for Fred. It could be something like that, but that visual cue goes up, or that, some of the sites, it's an IT trigger, but we haven't got to the stage where that trigger could follow them through. But what we do is have that ethos, so when they go to the ward, we are looking to cohort these patients on the same ward, and that's not always possible in the smaller hospitals, but you're creating an ethos then on a ward so that they don't drop, because that is the big risk. And partly what we would have done is if somebody was quite well on admission to the ward, they would just be discharged from all the services, that they're not really required, but actually they're hugely at risk until they get out. So creating that multidisciplinary thinking, creating the board rounds, the huddles, getting that what's called respectful challenge conversation happening, and just making sure those patients don't drop off, is a big part of that. So,
and I'm sure that for those people online, you mentioned as well, Fiona, that it's great to hear that within Ireland that there is a kind of a groundswell in networks being created with the help of Twitter. But you did mention the Acute Frailty Network, and I'm just thinking some people online mightn't be aware of what that is or how they maybe could access it, or can people access it?
Yeah, so Ireland joined the Acute Frailty Network a year ago, and 2 of our sites joined, which are St. Vincent's and Kilkenny, because Kilkenny were the first site to get off the ground with this work. They have benefited, I suppose, hugely from it. But you do pay to join the network, but they also, if you look on the Acute Frailty Network site, there is quite a bit of stuff that is quite freely available. For example, the Silver Book, which is a production from there, is available to download for free, and a lot of their so what it is you join and then you become part of a cohort They're all going through the journey together. And what we did in IEHD was, I suppose, what we learned as part of that was we shared that then with all of our sites. So we have access to all the various tools, etc. And what we have seemed to be doing very well here is getting the screening piece right in the emergency departments and getting that piece off the ground, which they, even though they have lots of other pieces going around the UK, they struggle with that piece around finding the frail. So it's interesting, just the difference. But the network is was founded originally by a number of multidisciplinary professionals who just wanted to come together to create that sort of network, and we certainly want to do that within IEHD. We have a clinical senate, which is from the consultants who want to do from the clinical leadership piece, but then the next piece is multidisciplinary to spread that, so that we create our own here.
And maybe last question, just to allow people to have five minutes of their lunch. Just, you mentioned a raft of different tools, and this slideshow will be available, and the recording will be available on the QI Talk Time webpage for people after. But if people were to go away from this, and if they're working in the area, is there one tool that you would say, you know, get people looking at this, get them thinking around it in their workplace? Is there one or a quick win that you would kind of send people off?
I would say start screening, and the clinical frailty scale is probably as easy as it gets. Then you do need to follow that up with the comprehensive assessment form, and obviously we'd be more than willing to share the ones that have been developed. We share them across sites. It's a two-pager, so it's a one. But I would say to get people off the ground, what you need to do is not be a lone voice. You need to find others. You need to create that coalition of the willing who are willing, because we have gone to sites where people have been working really hard on their own to try and do this, and it's actually not possible. There's too many people. The need is too great. And even if you were brilliant, you can't do it by yourself, because it requires a whole team of people to do what's required. So what you need is to go back to those 10 principles and find the people to make that piece happen, and I suppose take a longer view and go as close to the front door as possible. You know, find people at the very start of their journey and don't wait for the harm to happen.
Great. We do have one question here from Karina Noxon around maybe talking a little bit more about how you've covered integration with the community.
So I'll give you the example of here in Navan today. We probably have about 20 people in the room, and I would say 8 or 9 of those, we might actually have more than 20, but 8 or 9 are from the community. So we have from public health nursing, we have older people's managers, and so how we go about it is, starting with the visioning workshops, is that we bring everyone together. And what's really very interesting to staff when they go into this journey is realizing the shared values that they have, and that kind of helps with the barrier piece. I think there's one of the things that was shared this morning in our feedback around the learning from yesterday was the understanding of what the community are dealing with. I think we in the hospitals often feel that we are the only people who are managing this, and from the community perspective, it can feel a whole lot different. So I think that's very powerful, and just to create then, so in the testing then, and as we develop the services, we need the community all the way. So it might be that comprehensive geriatric assessment that's completed in the hospital goes out with the patient, that it's communicated, you know, so we make them IT enabled, something that's emailable. We try and create the link so that you can find out that community piece early. So it's all of that.
We've a lot actually of action happening now. So Alex is saying, delighted to see you referring to the document enabling risk and choice. That's great. Hi everyone, Bob Brown here, Western Health and Social Care Trust in Northern Ireland. Brilliant, great to see that.
Great. Yeah.
Our colleagues in the north. Could you explain the silver phone service, please?
So the silver phone, I suppose, is where you would have somebody like, it could be, ideally, I suppose it would be maybe your geriatrician, or it could be an A&P, or it would be somebody on the team. Now, it would be something that would be passed along, but it would be a rapid response. So if, for example, a very frail older person or an older person came into the emergency department and then suddenly started to deteriorate, which can happen. Once you start this work, you start to realize how quickly this sort of stuff happens. So maybe they start to develop an acute delirium, maybe their skin starts to break down. maybe it's just getting really bad really quickly, that you can get this rapid response of that expertise and clinical knowledge to the department really quickly. The other side then of the response mechanism is that you would have one point of contact if you want to find out about what's happening in the community. So rather than having to ring all the different services separately, that you would have one number, one referral point, one form, as standardized as possible. So it's basically trying to simplify that whole system.
Great.
Yeah.
Catherine's just saying, great presentation, possible to get a copy afterwards.
Absolutely.
Yes, you can go to QI Talk Time page on the Quality Improvement website. It's on the slide coming up, and all the slides and the recording of this will be there. Catherine Kill, I'm a physiotherapist working at Carlow, and she's doing a small project on frailty, looking at identifying frail elderly accessing our primary care service for physio. I hope to use the Rockwood scale as it would be used in frailty in Kilkenny. Is there any other measure that you think she should look at?
Yes, and there's a whole pile of them, and I actually, I suppose there's
to send her email address?
Yeah, if you wanted to send her email address, because I could share with you the list of tools that I used. I mean, there's all the obvious health and social care ones, things like, you know, I suppose there's different ones depending on what you want to do, but maybe what would be very nice to do would be if someone was working with you to do a mini CGA and consider all the components of that. And Kilkenny would be, I know, more than happy to get people out there in the community starting to use the same two-pager that they use, and maybe you need to come into Kilkenny and we talk about it all together. It'd be really good.
Yeah, Ciara Kirk, who is actually a colleague of mine, medication safety, so obviously that would be something really important for this patient group. Ciara leads on medication safety in the Quality Improvement Division, and she said she really likes the question, is it safe to admit this patient?
Yeah, I've just had an NCHD here in Navan just say that to me, that she would like, because we had talked about that yesterday, I think it was, that she would like her NCHDs to think about, you know, other her colleagues, because she said she would have always thought it's safer to admit until we know what's going on. Yeah. And I suppose assuming that we can't find out what's going on, so we need to make a bigger effort to find out what's going on, I suppose.
Amanda's asking actually a really nice question about screening tools for the community, for GPs and all included. I'm a physio in primary care in Clare, and feel that it would be valuable to try and identify these frail patients before even getting to the acute hospital. Yeah.
And again, I'd go back to the screening tool is the VIP, which is on the slide there, but there's also a frail tool that's developed in Scotland. It's like 5 questions, or you could use the clinical frailty scale and you know, as a broad screen. And I suppose if you could get into the practice of doing a brief CGA where you consider all the components, and again, we're more than willing to share a tool that's been developed here in IEHG, and maybe because screening is just screening, and screening will always pick up some, particularly you want screening to pick up some false negatives, so it's almost like picking up false positives, I should say, people who aren't really frail but aren't maybe, you know, picked up falsely, like that it's bearing on the side of caution, and then when you assess properly, you find that that's not the case, and that would be okay. Screening is only the start. It's really getting into beginning the CGA that's important.
And just a nice comment from Anne-Marie Minogue. She's just saying that, I know actually that was just moved there, so from Marie Doyle, who is basically agreeing with Ciara around the question, is it safe to admit, and asking why not home instead. So flipping that's nice. And we've one or two others very interesting and informative from Beatrice Moran. A lot of food for thought across all members of the MDT, an important area for nurse education going forward. Yes, Beatrice.
And I suppose with that, I'd be encouraging people to get involved with the TILD education if you haven't already, and find out where your facilitators are. Absolutely.
There's another comment here from Anne-Marie Minogue saying, once these frail patients are discharged from acute, they can be sent out to us in primary care, and the continuous challenge is waiting lists and not having specific and protective resources to meet the needs of these patients. Absolutely.
Yeah, and again, I guess it's that challenge around, there is no point in putting these people on a waiting list. You need to respond to them as it's happening. And again, I didn't really share so much of that experience around if you provide a very proactive emergency response, you reduce their care needs in the longer term, it means that they get back to life, I suppose, and they have limited time left, so they're not sitting on a list, maybe in pain, maybe waiting for something very simple that will make their life a whole lot better. So waiting lists are just counterintuitive. They don't work for frail people, and I think the sooner and the more we can get that message out, there is no point. But if you don't screen, and if you don't have the language around frailty, and you don't describe how frail people are, and you don't develop that consensus, it's very difficult to figure out who to see and who not to see. So getting it right from the acute sector, so that your asks are particular, I think will help the community decide what to prioritise, you know.
Lots of really lovely comments coming in. We just are running out of time. And just from Ciara, again, around medication. So she's saying from her perspective, trying to reduce medication-related harm in this group is really important.
Yes.
Can frailty screening results be made available more widely so professional groups like pharmacists can identify the patient?
Yes, and we've had huge amount of interaction with pharmacy, dietetics. The ones that, you know, don't often get considered in these teams or are thought of later, they are actually really critical. And the pharmacy piece in terms of finding drug interactions, finding risk, finding harm. A lot of our teams, as they're being established, have access to pharmacy. It might be very small, but it means those most at risk. And as we're developing all these new candidate ANPs who have a very good knowledge of medication, they can pick out the ones that are really need that pharmacy intervention. So yes, that's the ethos in which they're all being created, and all that's being asked is that so we have 2 pharmacists on our rapid improvement event here in Navan this week, so we absolutely couldn't agree more.
Another one here from Rachel. Hi, Rachel, in Beaumont, I think. From a radiology point of view, we would like to see an increase in the discharge to assess idea. Are you seeing more patients discharged and then to attend for their scans on an outpatient basis, ideally in the primary care centres that are planned? Would you agree?
I suppose 100%. We have, because again of the waiting list for what is considered to be routine stuff, that's a huge problem, and we have people then here spending a night or 2 nights on a trolley or in an escalation ward waiting to access maybe a routine x-ray for their lumbar spine or their back or whatever, because they're in pain, because they're, you know, simple enough osteoarthritic, etc., they're being over-medicated, this is causing them to fall or to develop cognitive issues, etc., etc., etc. So these kind of pathways, where frailty is the language, so you're then saying these people are at risk because they have these needs, they need a different pathway. That's absolutely the future. And again, we always have diagnostics, radiology, labs, etc., because they're the things that they really shouldn't have to wait for this stuff. You know.
We'll just finish off now. Liz, I suppose, has made a very valid point. The problem of doing CGA in the community is that you have you have to have somewhere for the patients to refer them on to, and the appropriate pathways are not currently available. And I suppose that's why this conversation needs to get started in all areas of the country and get people looking at pathways and integration from community to hospitals across both. Anne-Marie Collins, so have you looked at pathways in community and GP wraparound services for patients at different stages of the frailty journey to prevent hospital admissions? How Acute supports community? So again, it's stop flipping and flipping the thinking.
This is where you get your outreach services, where your hospital is reaching out and taking people out, and you're sharing their specialist knowledge, I suppose, out. And we do need new teams, and I suppose that's the next iteration. So this is the next plan around these discharge to assess type teams. We also need to provide outreach from hospitals going out to day centres and creating more of, you know, doing those multidisciplinary assessments in outreach areas. That absolutely needs to happen, and sharing that, I suppose, crossing over that domain being really critical. So I totally agree. I suppose in response to the thing around the community doing the CGA, I think the fact that services don't exist is not it would not be a reason not to do the CGA. It's really important to identify the care needs, and then that gives the language for helping to describe what is needed. Because at the moment it can be just a big glut of need, whereas actually when you start to get under it, you can really start to describe what's really underneath that and what people do need.
Thank you so much, and thanks for everyone online for all the engagement there on the chat box. It was great to get that flow of conversation going. And just to say, we hope actually to do another 1 or 2 webinars on this to kind of showcase the journey of some of the centres in terms of how they went about it, the challenges that they came up against, and what worked well.
That was
kind of things.
A very whistle-stop tour, and I think the sites themselves tell a very good story about their own journey, so that would be good.
So just to say thanks again so much to Fiona for joining us today on Talk Time. You will be able to get it on qualityimprovement.ie, and just another link there around the Quality Improvement Knowledge and Skills Guide. So our next Talk Time is on Tuesday the 27th of November, and I'm delighted that we're collaborating with the members of the UCD Health System, and this is actually, it could probably fit in quite nicely with the Frailty group. It's around that reporting and people's fear of reporting, and they've developed a really nice game, like a tool that they can use with health professionals to discuss why they don't report and making it easier for people to report. And this is up there ready to use and can be downloaded by staff to use. So this would be enabling people to use it, and a walkthrough of the actual game. So hopefully you can join us then, and thanks a million, and we'll see you hopefully then. Thank you.